Cop impounded black woman's car for inspection. Attorney General called before the tow truck left. The tow truck's flatbed groaned as the chains pulled tight around Elizabeth Whitmore's car, lifting the front tires slowly off the pavement while she stood on the shoulder of Route 9, arms crossed against the cold. "Officer Sinclair," she said, keeping her voice level, "I need you to explain to me, specifically, what safety violation justifies impounding a vehicle that passed state inspection 4 months ago?" Officer Gary Sinclair didn't look up from his clipboard. "Random compliance check, tail lights flickering, could be a wiring issue. Better safe than sorry. A flickering tail light doesn't require impounding my car on the side of a highway," Elizabeth said. "It requires a citation. You know that as well as I do." Sinclair finally glanced up, something almost amused behind his eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate you knowing the law so well. But I make the call out here, not you." 2 other cars had slowed as they passed, one driver lifting a phone to film through the windshield. Elizabeth reached calmly into her coat pocket for her own phone. "Then I'm going to make a call of my own." Sinclair smirked, clearly assuming it was an empty threat. Some frustrated woman dialing a friend or a lawyer who'd tell her the same thing he already had. That out here, on this stretch of road, his word was the only one that mattered. He had no idea the number she was dialing belonged to the direct line of the state attorney general's office, a line that connected, within 90 seconds, to a woman who already knew Elizabeth Whitmore's voice the moment she answered. He had no idea that the tow truck idling behind him wouldn't finish loading the car onto its flatbed before his entire night changed completely. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's go back and understand exactly who Elizabeth Whitmore really was. Elizabeth Whitmore had built her entire career on a simple, stubborn belief that the law meant nothing if it didn't apply the same way to everyone, regardless of who was standing on which side of the badge. She'd grown up in a modest neighborhood outside Richmond, Virginia, the daughter of a court reporter and a high school civics teacher, raised in a house where dinner conversations often turned into informal debates about fairness, precedent, and the difference between what was legal and what was right. She earned her law degree at 26, clerked for a respected federal judge for 2 years, and eventually found her way into the state attorney general's office, where she'd spent the last 9 years as senior counsel for the Civil Rights and Consumer Protection Division. The kind of quiet, unglamorous work that rarely made headlines but shaped, case by case, how ordinary people were treated by the systems meant to serve them. Elizabeth was known around the office for her calm, methodical thoroughness. She never raised her voice in a meeting. She never filed a case she hadn't triple-checked. Colleagues joked that she could recite state traffic code from memory faster than most officers could recite their own department's use of force policy. At home, she was raising her 12-year-old son, Julian, largely on her own since her divorce 3 years earlier, balancing long hours at the office with soccer practices, homework help, and the particular exhaustion of trying to be fully present for a child while carrying the weight of other people's injustices home with her most evenings. That Thursday evening, Elizabeth had been driving back from a late deposition 2 counties over, exhausted, eager to get home before Julian's bedtime. Her mind still half-occupied with the details of a case involving a nursing home chain accused of systematically overbilling elderly residents. She had no reason to expect trouble on Route 9. Her car was in good condition, her registration current, her driving well within the speed limit. She had no idea, pulling over obediently the moment Officer Sinclair's lights appeared behind her, that the next 90 minutes would test every ounce of the professional composure she'd spent 9 years building, or that the outcome would ripple through an entire county sheriff's department by the time the sun came up. Gary Sinclair had worked for the county sheriff's department for 14 years, and in that time he had developed what his supervisors politely called aggressive enforcement instincts, and what several quietly filed complaints, over the years, had described in considerably less flattering terms. He'd grown up in the same rural county he now patrolled, the son of a former deputy himself, and had absorbed early a particular worldview about who belonged on these roads and who didn't. A worldview he rarely examined out loud, but which showed up consistently in the patterns of who he pulled over and why. Sinclair liked the power of a traffic stop, liked the particular silence that fell over a car the moment his lights appeared in someone's rearview mirror. He'd built a quiet reputation among certain drivers in the county, a reputation that never showed up on his official record, because complaints against him, like complaints against several other longtime deputies, had a way of getting logged, reviewed, and closed without any real consequence. He'd started using vague safety inspection holds more frequently over the past 2 years, a discretionary tool that technically fell within department policy, but was, in practice, almost entirely unaccountable. No clear standard for what triggered one, no requirement to document the specific defect beyond a brief note on a form nobody upstairs ever seemed to double-check. He liked using it on cars that struck him as somehow not matching their driver. A newer sedan driven by someone in work clothes, an older car driven by someone dressed, as Elizabeth had been that evening, in the kind of tailored coat that suggested a long day at an office rather than a long day doing anything Sinclair privately assumed people who looked like her typically did. He'd pulled Elizabeth over for a tail light he'd later be unable to produce a single photograph of, on a road with almost no traffic, to witness what happened, at an hour when he assumed most people would simply want to go home, rather than fight a decision that would cost them a $200 impound fee and a full day arranging alternate transportation. He had no idea, standing on the shoulder of Route 9 that evening, that Elizabeth Whitmore had spent the last 9 years building a career specifically designed to make officers exactly like him accountable for decisions exactly like this one. He was about to find out in real time. "Ma'am, step back from the vehicle," Sinclair said, as the tow truck driver began securing the second set of chains. "This is standard procedure once a hold's been issued." "I'd like your badge number and your supervisor's direct line," Elizabeth said calmly, still holding her phone, the call to the Attorney General's office now connecting. "And I'd like you to know that I intend to file a formal complaint tonight, regardless of how this conversation goes." "File whatever you want," Sinclair said, unbothered. "Won't change what's happening to your car right now." A woman's voice came through Elizabeth's phone. "Attorney General's office, this is Nora." "Nora, it's Elizabeth. I need you to pull Deputy Chief Harmon's direct line and patch me through immediately. I'm on the shoulder of Route 9, being impounded without documented cause by a county deputy, and I want this handled correctly from the start." Sinclair's expression shifted slightly at the mention of an office he clearly hadn't expected, though his composure held. "Ma'am, who exactly are you calling?" "The State Attorney General's office," Elizabeth said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the stop began. "I work there, Senior Counsel, Civil Rights and Consumer Protection Division." Something flickered across Sinclair's face. Not quite alarm yet, more a flicker of recalculation, the particular look of a man realizing the situation might not unfold exactly the way he'd assumed it would. "That doesn't change department policy," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "The hold stands until—" "Elizabeth!" came a new voice through the phone, calm and immediately recognizable. "It's Margaret. Nora briefed me. Talk to me." Elizabeth felt something in her shoulders ease slightly at the sound of Margaret Hale's voice, the state attorney general herself, a woman Elizabeth had worked closely alongside for 6 years, and who happened, by simple coincidence of scheduling that evening, to still be at her desk when the call came through. "Margaret, I'm being impounded on Route 9 for an unspecified safety compliance issue that the deputy hasn't documented with a single photograph or citation. My car passed state inspection 4 months ago. I want this handled through proper channels, starting tonight." "Put him on," Margaret said simply. Elizabeth extended the phone toward Sinclair. "The Attorney General would like to speak with you directly." Sinclair stared at the phone for a long moment, the tow truck's engine still idling behind him, chains still holding her car's front tires several inches off the pavement, and for the first time all evening, his confidence visibly, unmistakably, faltered. Sinclair took the phone slowly, holding it to his ear with a stiffness that suggested he already understood, on some level, exactly how badly this conversation was likely to go. "This is Deputy Sinclair," he said. Elizabeth couldn't hear Margaret's side of the exchange, but she watched Sinclair's face carefully as it unfolded. The initial defensive posture, the slow shift toward something more careful, more measured, as whatever Margaret was saying clearly began landing with real weight. "I understand," Sinclair said finally, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been 10 minutes earlier. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." He handed the phone back to Elizabeth, and for a long moment said nothing at all, simply staring at the tow truck like he was seeing it for the first time. "Elizabeth," Margaret said, once the phone was back in her hands, "I've asked him to release your vehicle and provide full documentation of tonight's stop, including dash camera footage, before he leaves that shoulder. I've also asked the sheriff directly, not the deputy's immediate supervisor, to personally review this incident by morning. I know this isn't the first name we've discussed in this context, Elizabeth." That last sentence landed heavier than the rest, and Elizabeth felt a familiar, weary recognition settle over her. "No," she said quietly, "it isn't." Sinclair, still standing a few feet away, hadn't caught the full weight of that exchange, but he'd caught enough. The phrase, "not the first name," the particular stillness in Elizabeth's posture as she said it, to understand that whatever was happening tonight extended well beyond a single flickering tail light. He motioned reluctantly to the tow truck driver, who began the slow process of lowering Elizabeth's car back down to the pavement, chains loosening one by one in the cold evening air. "Ma'am," Sinclair said, his voice stiff, formal now in a way that hadn't been present at any point earlier in the stop, "I'll need you to sign this release form, acknowledging the vehicle's return." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment before taking the clipboard from his outstretched hand. "Before I sign anything, I want that dash camera footage preserved and formally logged tonight, not reviewed and quietly summarized tomorrow. I know exactly how these things tend to disappear when nobody's watching closely enough." Sinclair's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Understood." He had no idea, watching her sign the release form under the tow truck's harsh work lights, that this was only the very beginning of what tonight's decision was about to cost him. What Sinclair didn't know, what almost nobody outside a small circle within the Attorney General's office knew, was that this wasn't the first complaint Margaret Hale's phrase had quietly referred to that evening. 6 months earlier, the Civil Rights and Consumer Protection Division had begun a discreet review of impound and safety hold practices across 3 rural counties, prompted initially by an unrelated consumer fraud investigation into towing companies that had, almost as a side note, revealed a curious pattern buried in county impound logs. Certain deputies, across multiple departments, showed a disproportionately high rate of discretionary safety compliance holds compared to their peers. Holds that rarely resulted in a documented citation, rarely included photographic evidence of the alleged defect, and disproportionately involved drivers matching a narrow set of demographic patterns that had nothing to do with the actual condition of their vehicles. Gary Sinclair's name had appeared near the top of that list weeks before Elizabeth's own car was ever pulled over. Though she hadn't known, driving home from her deposition that evening, that she was about to become part of the very pattern her own office had already begun investigating. Margaret Hale certainly hadn't planned it this way, but sitting at her desk that evening, listening to Elizabeth describe the stop in real time, she'd recognized Sinclair's name immediately from the case file sitting open on her own desk, and understood, with a kind of grim clarity, that tonight's incident had just handed the investigation something it had been missing for months. A first-hand, credible witness, one who happened to be senior counsel for the very division running the review. Margaret hadn't mentioned any of this to Sinclair directly during their call. She'd kept her instructions simple, procedural, deliberately unrevealing. Release the vehicle, preserve the footage, expect a morning review. She wanted the incident documented cleanly, without giving Sinclair any advance warning of exactly how much scrutiny was about to land on his record. Elizabeth, driving the rest of the way home an hour later than planned, her hands still faintly unsteady on the wheel despite her outward composure at the scene, had no idea yet either exactly how deep the pattern beneath tonight's stop actually ran. She only knew, pulling into her driveway and seeing Julian's bedroom light still on, waiting for her, that she intended to find out completely, whatever it took. Elizabeth filed her formal complaint the following morning before her son had even finished breakfast, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, documenting every detail of the previous night's stop with the same methodical precision she brought to every case that crossed her desk. By 10 o'clock, she was in Margaret Hale's office, the county's preliminary dash camera footage already pulled up on a shared screen between them. The footage confirmed exactly what Elizabeth had suspected. No visible tail light malfunction was evident in the recording at any point before. Sinclair's lights activated. His own report, filed hastily the night before, cited suspected electrical issue. Driver unable to confirm functioning status. A justification that fell apart entirely under even minimal scrutiny, since Elizabeth herself had explicitly told him, on camera, that all her lights had been functioning normally when she'd checked them that same morning before leaving for her deposition. "This isn't just weak," Margaret said, watching the footage a second time. "It's fabricated. He's citing a defect he never actually documented seeing." "How many others?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Does this connect to?" Margaret pulled up a case file on her second monitor, one Elizabeth hadn't yet seen. 11 confirmed incidents in the last 18 months involving Sinclair specifically. Similar pattern each time. Vague safety hold, no photographic evidence, disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic drivers. Resolved either through paid impound fees or, in a few cases, quietly dropped charges that never should have been filed in the first place. Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her chest. The professional distance she usually maintained around case files slipping, slightly now that she understood, firsthand, exactly what those 11 other names had experienced. "I want to lead this," Elizabeth said. Formally. Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You're a witness in this case now, Elizabeth. That complicates your ability to lead the broader investigation." "Then let me lead the piece that's specifically mine," Elizabeth said, "and bring in outside counsel to handle the parts where my involvement creates a conflict. I'm not interested in stepping back from this because of what happened to me personally. I'm interested in making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to an 11th person who doesn't have an attorney." General's direct line saved in their phone. Margaret nodded slowly, something like respect settling into her expression. "All right, we'll structure it that way. But Elizabeth, I need you to prepare yourself. This is going to get uncomfortable before it gets resolved. Sinclair has 14 years with that department. People will push back." Elizabeth thought of Julian's bedroom light, still on when she'd finally pulled into her driveway the night before, and the particular fear that had settled over her in those first few minutes on the shoulder of Route 9. Not fear of Sinclair specifically, but the older, more familiar fear of being disbelieved by a system built in ways both obvious and subtle to protect the very people meant to hold it accountable. "I've been uncomfortable before," Elizabeth said quietly. "I can manage uncomfortable. What I can't manage is watching this happen to somebody else because I decided it was easier to just let my own car get fixed and move on." The investigation expanded quickly over the following 3 weeks, Elizabeth's own case serving as the credible, well-documented anchor that gave the broader pattern the weight it had previously lacked. Investigators re-interviewed each of the 11 prior complainants, several of whom had assumed, understandably, that nothing would ever come of their original reports. A young man named Marcus Doyle, stopped 8 months earlier under nearly identical circumstances, described losing his job after missing 3 consecutive shifts, arranging alternate transportation once his car was impounded. A consequence that had never once been considered when Sinclair filed his original report. An elderly woman named Dorothy Pratt, stopped 11 months prior, had paid the $200 impound fee out of a fixed retirement income rather than risk what she described, in her interview, as making more trouble for myself with a man who clearly already decided what kind of person I was before I even rolled down my window. Each new interview added another layer to a pattern that, laid out fully for the first time, painted an unmistakable picture of discretionary power wielded consistently, over years, against people least equipped to challenge it. Sinclair, placed on administrative duty pending the outcome of the review, grew increasingly agitated as the investigation's scope became clear to him, eventually retaining an attorney who argued, in a formal response submitted to the department, that his safety holds fell within acceptable policy discretion, and that any pattern investigators identified was, at most, circumstantial rather than intentional. "There's no policy anywhere in this department's manual," the attorney's letter read, "that requires photographic documentation for every discretionary safety compliance hold. My client exercised judgment consistent with 14 years of training and experience." Elizabeth read that letter twice in her office, feeling a familiar, weary frustration at the particular language institutions reached for when defending patterns too consistent to be coincidence. "Judgment," she said aloud to Margaret, who had stopped by to discuss the department's formal response, "isn't a defense when the judgment itself is the problem." "Agreed," Margaret said, "which is exactly why we're not just pursuing this as a policy violation anymore." Elizabeth looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret said, "the pattern is now strong enough and consistent enough across demographic lines that I've authorized a formal civil rights referral. This isn't just about fixing a policy gap anymore, Elizabeth. It's about whether Gary Sinclair's conduct over the last 2 years constitutes an actionable pattern of discriminatory enforcement." The weight of that sentence settled over the room, and for the first time since the stop on Route 9, Elizabeth allowed herself to feel something closer to cautious hope rather than simple professional resolve. Before joining the Attorney General's office, before law school, before any of the career that had eventually put her on the other end of a phone call that stopped a tow truck in its tracks, Elizabeth Whitmore had been a 19-year-old college sophomore riding in the passenger seat of her older brother's car during a traffic stop that still, over 2 decades later, occasionally surfaced in her dreams. Her brother Thomas, 22 at the time, had been pulled over for a broken taillight that turned out, upon later inspection, to be perfectly functional. What began as a routine stop escalated over 20 tense minutes into a search of the vehicle, both of them ordered out onto the shoulder of a busy highway, hands visible, while the officer searched the trunk for nearly 15 minutes and found absolutely nothing. No apology followed. No acknowledgement of the mistake. Just a warning to drive safe, and a citation for the taillight that Thomas would later prove, with photographic evidence, had never actually been broken at all. Elizabeth remembered, most vividly, the particular helplessness of that moment. Not the fear exactly, though there had been plenty of that too, but the deeper, more corrosive realization that being right, having done nothing wrong at all, simply hadn't mattered in the moment it counted most. She had decided, sitting in that passenger seat at 19 years old, that she would spend her life working to close the gap between what the law promised and what it actually delivered to people who looked like her and her brother. Standing on the shoulder of Route 9 decades later, phone in hand, watching her own car's tires slowly lower back onto the pavement, Elizabeth had felt that same 19-year-old fear resurface for just a moment, quickly steadied this time by the professional composure she'd spent years building specifically to answer moments exactly like it. She thought of Thomas often during the 3 weeks of investigation that followed, wishing, in a quiet corner of her mind she rarely let herself visit, that someone with her current authority had existed to call on his behalf all those years ago. She couldn't undo what happened to her brother. But sitting across from Margaret Hale, reviewing 11 case files that represented 11 versions of that same old helplessness, she understood, with complete clarity, exactly why this particular fight mattered so deeply to her. Not as an abstract point of policy, but as a debt owed to a 19-year-old girl who had once believed, however briefly, that nothing would ever change. The formal civil rights hearing convened 6 weeks later in a modest state. Administrative building, Sinclair seated at a table beside his attorney, the sheriff himself present in the gallery, along with several of the original 11 complainants who had chosen, after months of investigation, to attend in person. Elizabeth sat at the prosecution's table alongside outside counsel, her own testimony scheduled for the hearing's second day, having spent weeks preparing every detail of her own stop, with the same rigor she'd apply to any case that wasn't personally hers. The hearing officer, a measured, careful woman named Judge Rebecca Sanders, listened over 2 full days as evidence accumulated, dash camera footage from multiple stops, testimony from Marcus Doyle about his lost job, Dorothy Pratt's quiet, dignified account of the $200 that had strained her, retirement income, and finally, Elizabeth's own detailed, methodical account of the stop on Route 9. "I want to be direct about something," Elizabeth told the hearing on the second day, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I had access to resources that night that none of the other 11 complainants had. A direct line to the Attorney General. A career built specifically to understand my rights in that exact moment. Most people don't have that. Most people simply pay the fee, lose the day's wages, and go home feeling smaller than they did that morning. Exactly the way I might have, if I'd had a different job." Sinclair, seated across the room, kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him throughout most of her testimony, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the particular stillness of a man watching a reckoning he could no longer avoid. "That's exactly why this hearing matters," Elizabeth continued. "Not because of what happened to me specifically, but because what happened to me is, by every measure in this case file, a documented pattern that happened to at least 11 other people who didn't have the same resources to push back." Judge Sanders's ruling came 3 weeks later, finding Gary Sinclair's conduct over the preceding 2 years constituted a sustained pattern of discriminatory enforcement in direct violation of state civil rights protections. The department was ordered to implement mandatory photographic documentation for all discretionary safety holds, provide restitution to each of the 11 confirmed complainants, and submit to independent quarterly review of impound practices for the following 3 years. Sinclair was formally terminated the following week, his certification suspended pending a separate state licensing board review that would, 7 months later, permanently revoke his ability to serve in law enforcement anywhere in the state. 6 months after the hearing concluded, Elizabeth stood at a small podium inside the same administrative building, delivering remarks at the department's first quarterly compliance review, a now public session, required under Judge Sanders's ruling, where impound and safety hold. Statistics were presented transparently rather than buried in internal logs nobody outside the department ever saw. Dorothy Pratt sat in the third row, her restitution check finally received the previous month, watching Elizabeth speak with an expression of quiet, hard-won satisfaction. Marcus Doyle sat 2 rows behind her, having recently started a new job with the help of a reference letter Elizabeth had personally written on his behalf, unable to undo the months of hardship the original incident had caused, but determined to help however she still could. 6 months ago, Elizabeth told the room, 11 people had their trust in this system broken by a pattern that went unaddressed for nearly 2 years, because complaints against certain officers had a way of disappearing before they ever reached anyone with the authority to act on them. That ends today, and it ends permanently, because this department now operates under the kind of transparency that should have existed from the very beginning. She looked out over the room, finding Margaret Hale's steady, approving gaze near the back, and continued. "I want to be honest about something else," Elizabeth said. "I've spent 9 years in this work believing deeply in the promise of the law. But it took my own car getting impounded on the side of a highway for this particular pattern to finally receive the attention it deserved. That's not justice working the way it should. That's justice working the way it too often actually does. Reactive, rather than proactive, responding loudest to the voices with the most access rather than the greatest need." The room fell quiet, the weight of that honesty settling over everyone present. "So going forward," Elizabeth continued, "this department isn't just correcting one officer's pattern. It's committing to catching the next pattern before it takes 11 complaints, or a lucky phone call, to finally be believed." The applause that followed was measured, thoughtful, the particular kind that comes not from triumph, but from the quiet, hard-earned relief of watching a broken system finally begin repairing itself, piece by careful piece. That evening, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table with Julian, helping him with a history assignment about the civil rights movement. The same kitchen table where she'd filed her formal complaint 6 months earlier, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop. "Mom," Julian said, looking up from his notebook, "did you ever think, when that cop pulled you over, that it would turn into all of this?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things Julian asked her these days, understanding that his curiosity deserved an honest answer rather than a simplified one. "No," she said. "I thought I was going to be late getting home to you and annoyed about paying an impound fee for something that wasn't even real. I had no idea it would turn into anything bigger than that." "Are you glad it did?" Julian asked. Elizabeth thought of Dorothy Pratt's restitution check, of Marcus Doyle's new job, of the 11 names that had finally, after months of investigation, received something closer to acknowledgement than they'd ever expected. "I'm glad the truth finally got the attention it deserved," she said. "I would have rather it hadn't taken me getting stopped for that to happen. But I'm grateful it did, in the end, because now maybe the next person won't need a phone call to the Attorney General's office just to be believed." Julian nodded slowly, returning to his notebook, and Elizabeth watched him for a long moment, feeling something settle deep in her chest that had taken 6 long months of careful, exhausting work to finally, fully arrive. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and considerably more durable than that. Progress. So tell us, where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have done if you were standing on that highway shoulder, watching your own car get lifted onto a tow truck for no real reason at all? Do you think Elizabeth was right to lead her own investigation despite being a witness in the case? And what did you think of her honesty at the compliance review about how reactive justice too often really is? Let us know your favorite moment down in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, Subscribe if you're new here, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth, once it finally gets a fair hearing, has a way of setting everything right. We'll see you in the next story.